So I think we left in verse 10, if I'm not mistaken. Is that true? All right, so to kind of review, Peter has written to this group of people who are exiles. They are scattered people, and he has given them several commands. And now he is beginning to talk to them about the servants of God who were prophesying about Christ. And so in verse 8, he says, even though you've not seen him, 11, even though you do not see him now, you believe in him and are filled with unspeakable. And we talked about unspeakable meaning unable to be uttered. Joy and glory, and that you are receiving. We talked about the fact that receiving is, and I'm sorry, but it's a middle present. All right, and you remember that in our discussion the last time, the middle voice means one that you're taking on your own. Okay, so it says you are receiving, so it literally means that you are grabbing it and pulling it to yourself. It's not like somebody is walking up to you and handing it to you. Okay, it's out there, but you must receive it. You must grab it. All right. And you're receiving this glory and joy, and you're receiving the result of your faith, all right, the salvation of your souls. And then he says, about this salvation, the prophets who prophesied of the grace that would come to you did much research and investigation. And those two words are very interesting because of what they really mean. The word research means to seek in order to obtain. To seek in order to obtain. So you all remember in high school and in college, all right, if you went, that one of the things that you had to do is you had to do a research paper. And so generally what that meant was you had to go to the library and you had to look at something other than an encyclopedia, all right, and you had to seek out something so that you might obtain it. And what you did was you read it and you wrote down note cards and you wrote down who wrote it and you cited it and so on. And so the research that is there is they were seeking it in order to obtain. Now, I know that you all remember this clearly and that you're becoming Greek scholars, but the tense of the word seek is aorist. And you remember I told you that the aorist tense means, in this case, an unqualified time. Okay, so for example, you're looking at a picture. In that picture, that picture is occurring when you're looking at it. You know, and if you turn your back and you walk away and then you come back, the picture is again, if you're looking at it, that's when it's occurring. You know, if you look at the Mona Lisa, she's smiling at you just then. And if you come back 6 weeks from now and you look at the Mona Lisa, she's smiling at you just then. That's what the aorist tense is. And this is what is used here. It says they are researching. And it means it's a constant thing. It's ongoing. It's never ending. It's something that is completely in control of you. That they are researching and they are investigating. Now this is kind of it's kind of like saying something like more full. Okay, you know, once you're doing something, you're researching, you're actually doing it, and then investigating on top of it. So you know, my glass is more full than your glass. Well, how can it be more full? You know, full is full. But really, that's what Peter is saying here. That they are not only researching it, meaning constantly investigating, but then they are also diligently doing that. Right? So it's not something like, oh man, I got to write a research paper. It's I'm diligently looking at this. I'm diligently finding it. I'm diligently searching it. I'm diligently trying to change. Right? I was just speaking with a person I meet with every Wednesday morning, and we happen to be dealing with early church history. He's kind of a history nut, and so he wanted to talk about early church history. So we're looking at authors in early church writing, and so we're kind of going through that. And one of the things he said today was, he says, it seems to me that when God said, love the Lord your God with all your heart, mind, and soul, the author seemed to be saying that this is a continuous thing. And I said, yep, that's exactly what it means. And he said, but how do I do that? How do I love other people continually? How do I, no matter what, how do I love them? He just about bought a house, and he had a bad feeling about the house. And so instead of using the realtor's inspector, he went out and researched and hired his own inspector, all right, who gave him a 69-page report on why he shouldn't buy that house. He says, how do I love the realtor who was basically doing it for his own good? How do I do that? And I told him there's only one way to do that, and that's always to be focused on Christ. Never to be focused on yourself, and never to be focused on what's going on. And well, how do I focus on Christ? Well, in the early church, and many people today have something called the Jesus prayer. It's a very simple prayer. Okay, it's a one-sentence thing, right? It's, Lord Jesus, Son of God, forgive me, I'm a sinner. That's it. Lord Jesus, Son of God, forgive me, I'm a sinner. Lord Jesus, Son of God, forgive me, I'm a sinner. And as you're saying that, what are you doing? You're not only confessing, but you're focusing with that confession. And as you're focusing, what are you doing? You're continually researching and reevaluating and doing the same things that these people were doing. You're investigating. What is it about me that I have to give up? How am I being humble? And how am I confessing? And how am I looking at myself realistically? And this is exactly what the prophets of old were doing. They were receiving the result of the faith, the salvation of your souls, and about this salvation, what salvation? The salvation of me. Right? The prophets who prophesied of the grace that come did much research and investigation. And then it says they were investigating the time and the circumstances that the Spirit of Christ, which pointed to them by predicting the sufferings of Christ. They were investigating the time and the circumstances. When is it going to occur? What is going to happen? And then they moved to predicting the sufferings of Christ and write down Isaiah 53. This is what they were investigating. In verse 11, where they're predicting the sufferings of Christ, Isaiah 53. And then the glories that would follow them, Isaiah 11. And they didn't know how to put the two together. How can you have a suffering servant who's going to bring in the kingdom? They predicted the sufferings and the glories that would follow. Okay? And in Matthew chapter 13, and I'm going to turn there, Matthew chapter 13, verses 16 and 17. We're going to look at that real quick. You'll remember the context of Matthew chapter 13. In Matthew chapter 12, Jesus has healed the person, and he has been told that he's done it by Beelzebub, and so he responds to that and says, how can Beelzebub throw out Beelzebub? And then in chapter 13 he says, if you acquaint my work with that of Satan, you can't be saved because you're committing the sin against the Holy Spirit, right? And in verses 16 and 17, he says this: "Blessed are your eyes." You remember. He's talking to the disciples, and he's telling them in verse 15, For this people's heart, the Jews, have become callous. They hardly hear with their ears. They have closed their eyes. Otherwise, they might see with their eyes, hear with their ears, and understand with their hearts, and in turn, and I would heal them. And then he says to the disciples, blessed are your eyes because they see, and your ears because they hear. Now, I have some good mechanical hearing on my ears now, so I can hear better, all right? But so they hear, all right? For truly I say to you, many prophets and righteous people longed to see what you see, but did not see it, and hear what you hear, but did not hear it. Many people before you sought this information, sought what was going on, how God was going to do this, and they constantly looked at it. Now it's occurring. So Peter says these people were investigating and searching out and looking at the sufferings of Christ and looking at the glories that would follow, and you now have that. This is yours now. It is ours. We know what happened. We don't have to worry about looking forward to something. It's here. It's ours. And in verse 12 he then says, they received revelation that they were servants of these things. They received revelation that they were servants. Now the word servant is the same word that we get the word deacon from. Okay? It means to wait upon. It means the work, to be focused on the work that is to be done and not on the relationship between the Lord and the servant. It is a focus on what we have to do. They received the revelation that they were to work. Not necessarily the relationship that they had to that work, but they were to work. They were servants of these things, not for themselves, but for you. It wasn't that they were searching it out for themselves. They recognized that they're searching it out for us. We have the same responsibility. Remember that page I gave you that said applications for chapter 1? Okay, this is one of the applications that you can do. Our service to God is not for ourselves. The clothes closet and food pantry is not for you. It's for others. The service that we give is not for us. It's so that others might know Christ. Right? And so they received the revelation that what they were doing was not for themselves but for us. We receive the revelation that what we are doing is not for ourselves but for others. What we do is for other people. And as long as our focus is on that, you'll remember what Jesus said about the greatest commandment when he was asked. Hey, Lord, tell us what the greatest commandment is. Haha, we're going to fool you. And he says, there are two. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, mind, and soul, Deuteronomy 6:5. And what's the second one? Love your neighbor as yourself. In that, all of the law is taken care of. That is our responsibility. We are servants. Notice that's the application. That's not the interpretation. Interpretation is the prophets before were servants. Application, I have to be a servant. We are servants of those things, not for themselves, but for you. These things have now been announced to you by those who preach the good news, by the Holy Spirit sent from heaven, and even angels desire to gaze upon these things. Now wait a minute. You figure that they had the inside track. I mean, they're up there with God, you know? So you'd figure that they would have the inside track, and the answer is they don't. In Hebrews 1:14, it says, angels wanted to know and were amazed about Christ. The Holy Spirit sent from heaven, and the angels desired to gaze upon the things that we have, the things that we know. And then he says something very interesting. He says, prepare your minds for actions. Now, those of us who are in military service, we might remember if we ever got on board a ship, all right? When that bell rang, what did that bell ringing mean? Battle stations, all right? Now, we in the United States call them battle stations. You know what the British call them? Action stations. Not battle stations. Action stations. And that's exactly what the term translated here means. It says, prepare your minds for action. Now, it may be warfare, but it's more than that. And so the word prepare there means to bind up long flowing robes. Now, this is a picture. You know that in the Middle East, okay, that people wear long flowing robes, particularly, you know, in the early times, okay? And so running, y'all women, have you ever run in a dress? Okay? You know, Ginger Rogers was asked one time, you know, what do you think of Fred Astaire's dancing? And I paraphrase now. She says, I think it's great, but I do it backwards and in high heels. When you have something around your legs that's 30 inches wide and you can't run. So they hike it up, and they had a sash around them like a belt, and they tuck it into their belt. And they tuck it all the way around so that their legs were free. That's the picture that is the word prepare. It means to get the clutter out of the way. Right? Guess what tense this is? It's aorist. Aorist means never ending, always there. And guess what voice it is? Well, you never thought you'd learn about English in here, did you? Okay? The voice is middle voice. You yourself are to do this. Your responsibility is you hike up your pants. You get the stuff out of the way. It's your responsibility to do that. It's not God's responsibility to get the stuff out of the way. It's you're the person who clears the decks. I just took a little course on safety for the Civil Air Patrol thing. And one of the things they camped on was it was our responsibility that if we see something in the way, don't walk by it, pick it up, because the next guy may trip over it. It's our responsibility to clear the decks. For us. That's the middle voice. Okay? The second thing is, it says prepare your minds for action. Ephesians 6:14. We are to be at war. Remember Ephesians 6 talks about the armor of God? Okay? That's what it is. We are to prepare our minds for actions. This actually is an idiom. It's only one word. Okay? And it means all this stuff. All right? That's what the picture is. And then he says, be sober. And the word sober is not, don't drink. Now that's an application, right? But it doesn't mean interpretation. It's not talking about drinking. It's talking about be clear-headed. Right? Don't take an Ambien and drive. Be clear-headed. Well, how am I clear-headed? I do the things that help my body be clear. I get enough sleep. Right? I eat right. I exercise as my body allows me to. Right? That may mean getting up and walking across the room, but it's still an exercise. Right? I don't use the wheelchair to get there. I get out of the chair and I walk if I can walk. Okay? Be sober. Be prepared. That is where we're to be. Right? Therefore, and you remember, when you see a therefore, you ask, what is it there for? Therefore, be prepared. Be sober. And then he says, and set your hope fully on the grace that brought you by the revelation of Jesus Christ. Set your hope fully on the grace that brought you by the revelation of Jesus Christ. God brought us the revelation of Christ, each one individually. You didn't get there on your own. He brought you that revelation. He had somebody talk to you. He had somebody preaching for you. He had somebody praying with you. He had somebody who somehow showed up and presented you to Christ in some way. Nobody comes alone. Nobody. Set your hope on what? That it was God who brought us to Christ. Therefore, what are we to be? Be children of obedience. Verse 14. Be children of obedience. Obedience literally means be subject to the saving will of God as revealed through Christ. Be children of that saving will through Christ. We are to be subject to Christ. We're to be children. What does it mean to be a child? It means to be trusting. It means to be aware. It means to be excited. You know, all of you know that we have a bunch of grandchildren. And Jack is the one that we live with regularly. Yesterday, my son John gave Jack a box, and I mean a box of baseball cards. These were baseball cards that John and George both had when they were growing up. So, you know, they're 20 years old. That kid was in hog heaven. He was excited. He was thrilled. He got them out on the dining room table. This box is still there. It's still packed up. And he's separating cards by teams. Okay? And then he's going to go and he's going to separate the teams and he's going to put all the people together in the teams and then he's going to... And he understands that he did nothing to get those cards. He didn't buy them. He didn't ask for them. They were just given to him. That's exactly what God has done for us. And therefore, we are to be obedient. Because when John dropped that box off, the thing he told Jack was, separate them so that you know what you have. How do we know what we have? We read, we pray, we fellowship with one another, we talk to one another, we share things with one another. That's how we know what we have. Therefore, prepare your minds for action. Be sober. Set your hope fully on the grace that has brought you by the revelation of Jesus Christ. Be obedient children. Be kids who are excited about what they see and what they have. And do not conform yourself to your former lusts. That word conform there is very interesting. It means to fashion yourself like something else. Now, it's not the same word that's used in Romans 12. Remember in Romans 12 it says, and be not transformed, be not conformed, but be transformed. Okay? The word there, this is a negative. Do not conform. In Romans 12, it's a positive. Be transformed. Okay? So, do not conform yourself. That means don't make yourself look the exact same way. To what? Our former lusts. Now, lusts here does not mean our sexual drive or drive of desire for money or power or whatever. What it means here is don't be conformed to the way you were. He's not talking about specific things. He's talking about a generalized confirmation. Don't be conformed to the way you were. Don't look like you were. You know, a funny story about D.L. Moody. D.L. Moody was an evangelist in the 19th century in Chicago. By the way, the reason you come to Sunday school is because of D.L. Moody. D.L. Moody was significant in the formation of Sunday schools. The reason that we grew up going to the YMCA, D.L. Moody. D.L. Moody was one of the founders of the YMCA. Okay, so D.L. Moody is an important person. Moody Bible Institute in Chicago still exists. Okay, they're a school that charges no tuition. Now they charge room and board, but they charge no tuition for their schooling. And they're an undergraduate. They've got a graduate degree too now, but they're predominantly undergraduate. Anyway, do not conform yourself to your former lusts. One time D.L. Moody was preaching in a town. He was an evangelist, okay? Preaching in a town, and he was on his way to the Coliseum or the auditorium, and there was a man laying in the street just right in front of the door of where he was going to go in. And the man looked up to him, and he's drunk, you know, he's laying in the street, and he says, "Here, D.L. Moody. Oh, you saved me last week." And Moody's response was, "I must have, because it surely isn't God." Do not be conformed to the way you were. Rather, be conformed to God. And he uses the word called. And he says, be conformed, but just as he who called you is holy. Guess what? Here we go again. The word call is aorist. So what does that mean? He calls you and 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 calls you. It's a never-ending call. You know, one of the things that we as Baptists have kind of messed up with is we talk about getting people saved, you know, and really concentrating on when were you saved. And while that is important, I will not say that it's not important, it really doesn't make a lick of difference. Because real honestly, if I was saved 50 years ago, and I'm the same as I was then, I got a real problem. I haven't grown. Do not conform yourselves to former lusts, but just as he who is constantly reaching out to you, constantly calling you, constantly giving you these things, he is holy. And the word holy there is separation, righteousness, devotion of service, everything. About 45 minutes from where Tony lives, where Tony's hometown is in Greece. Okay? One time I said, my hometown in Greece, and somebody said, you're not Greek. You know, well, go look at my door. You know, I've got a sign that says parking for Greeks only. You know, I'm as much Greek as Tony is. You know, Tony was born Greek, I'm Greek by the grace of God. Okay? In Greece, about 45 minutes from where she lives, there is a town. And there's a church in this town. And you can go to this church and you can stand next to, and stand in as a matter of fact, the place where 10 martyrs died for their faith at this church. They were beheaded right there. And the name of the town is Agios Theka. Pen. That's not that pen. Where's my, there it is. Agios Theka. But just as he who called you is Agios, just as he who called you is holy, there are 10 people there who died for Christ. And they renamed the town to the 10 Holy Ones. Just as he who called you is holy. Holiness is something that means you are completely surrounded by. This is not something that you kind of nudge up to. You are completely surrounded by it. Just as God is holy, and then turn the page to page 4, you yourselves should also be holy, only in some things of your life. Now, it's not what it says. It says, you yourselves should be holy in every aspect of your life. That means when you watch TV, when you listen to the radio, when you're driving the car and the person in front of you is an absolutely terrible driver, you might remain holy instead of using adjectives to describe that person. And one of the favorite adjectives used by men is woman. Oh, that's a woman. You should be holy in every aspect of your life. Right? Now I'm going to get to meddling here. Okay? So please forgive me for this. Okay? I'm going to stop preaching and start meddling. Okay? We generally tend to think our holiness is in our actions, right? What we do. Okay? Sometimes we get really circumspectual and we say, yeah, sure enough, it's in what we think. But we tend to leave out something. we tend to leave out how we treat ourselves. Boy, I'm really going to meddle. We tend to leave out how we eat, how we sleep, how we care for ourselves. Notice it says in every aspect of your life, you do this. In everything you do. Well, eating is a significant part of life. And if we don't eat, it's just as bad as if we eat too much. Or if we really, really love fatty food, it's just as bad as, going overboard on other stuff. Now, I happen to have found some almond milk ice cream. As you know, the doctor told me that I couldn't have meat or dairy or anything along those lines. So I happened to be at a person's house, and he said, "We found some almond milk ice cream." Almond milk ice cream, yeah, this is going to be good. Right? It really is good. Now, when you buy it, you'll end up being poor for the rest of the month, but it's good. Right? So you buy this little thing, it costs you $6, but if you have a spoonful a night, it satisfies the urge, so to speak, right? But you are to be holy in that which you eat. You're to be holy in that how you take care of yourself. It's every aspect of your life that you're holy in, not just your religious life. And we tend to forget that. We tend to forget that part of who we are is part of who we are. We just don't concentrate on taking care of ourselves all that much, particularly as we get older. And it says, because it is written, "Be holy, for I am holy." Why should we take care of ourselves? Why should we be holy? Because God is holy. It's not the fact that we're holy because we want to be good. It's be holy because the person to whom we are related is holy. That's our responsibility. So I'll give you a couple of verses. Leviticus 19:2, Leviticus 27. God tells the Jews they are to be holy because he is holy. Peter says, guess what? It didn't only follow for them. It follows for us as well as them. We are to be holy. Why? Because God is holy. And because we are related to him, we are that responsibility. I was listening to a man by the name of Dennis Prager on YouTube. He was with Ravi Zachariah. Joe, is your new material from Ravi Zachariah? Is that what the new material is?
No, I don't think it's.
Okay. Is it a book like The Life Beyond or something like that?
Yeah, life. Talking about our department.
Yeah.
We're going to study.
Yeah.
I don't have it with me.
Tony's teaching one. A couple of classes are teaching one by Ravi Zachariah. It's kind of a bright-looking cover. Anyway. So I was listening to Ravi Zachariah, and he's an apologist, brilliant dude. He comes from India, right? And he, interestingly enough, I don't know how he did it. He speaks like one of my professors who came from Scotland, and I don't quite know how he does it, but he did. Anyway, he was on a stage with Dennis Prager, who happens to be Jewish, and I think I've forgotten why I was saying this. Dennis Prager was talking about the issue of holiness and how in Judaism the requirement is holiness. And Zechariah comes back and says it's exactly the same thing in Christianity. You are holy because God is holy. That's our responsibility. And then it says, verse 17, If you call on him who judges without discrimination, if you call on him who judges without discrimination, that's bad news for us. Right? He doesn't care who we are. Right? He doesn't care whether or not I'm rich or I'm poor. Right? If we judge without discrimination according to everyone's work as Father. Now, I have an interesting story. I think you'll be very interested in this. As most of you know, I grew up in a very, very wealthy family. I mean, we were old money from New England. And when I say old money, I mean old money from New England. And my grandfather was a very staid, righteous, typical 19th century male. You know, he existed to frustrate the children. I mean, that, you know, right? So at any rate, one of the things that he had was he had racing horses, but they were trotters. You know what a trotter is, you know, you sit on a surrey and you know. Crude people ride on the backs of horses and race. Trotters are a gentleman's sport. You know, horse racing where you've got a jockey ride, that's, you know. So anyway, so he owned trotters. And I have several loving cups and New York Times articles about these trotters that won races, right? At any rate, so my father loved horse riding. Now, it was only English saddle. You know, Western saddle, you know, again, that was for crude people. English saddle was, you know. So my father loved riding horses. And he must have been 13 or 14 at the time. And he got on the subway with some friends of his after riding the horse. And unbeknownst to him, at the other end of the subway was my grandfather, who saw his son. Now, my father didn't see my grandfather. And so my father, being 13 or 14 years old and being a boy and being in New York riding the subway, you know, I mean, boys do things, right? So he kind of ran down the train and grabbed one of those center poles and twirled around it and then ran back, never saw my grandfather. Never, ever saw my grandfather. So they got home and they sat down for dinner. Now, again, everybody dressed for dinner. When I was growing up until I was almost 18. Yeah, almost 18. I was probably, my father died in March, and so we came back to Connecticut in just after graduation from high school. So I was almost 18. So from the time that I could sit at the dining room table, which wasn't until I was 7 because I wasn't good enough, okay? From the time I sat at the dining room table until my father died, we dressed for dinner. I had a coat and a tie every night for dinner. Okay? And if somebody came over and didn't have a coat or a tie, my father had a coat or a tie for them, because you did not sit down without dressing for dinner. So this is the environment, right, that my father was growing up in and I grew up in. So my father comes into the dining room and my grandfather is sitting there, and they sit down and they start eating dinner, and the servants leave, and my grandfather says to my father, "Frank, did you ride your horse today?" And my father said, "Oh, yes, Dad, I really did." And he said, "Frank, do you like riding your horse?" And my father said, "Oh, yes, Dad, I really, really love riding him." He says, do you really love your horse, Frank?" He said, "Yes, I really love my horse." He says, "I just sold it." And then he explained why. "I saw you in the subway, twirling around." That's the world my father grew up in. And he kind of passed it on to us as he grew up. As an aside, right, I was sitting with my older brother a couple of years ago. We were having dinner, and I wasn't dressed, by the way. I had a short sleeve shirt, and he was a short sleeve shirt, so we don't do that anymore. So anyway, we were at a restaurant, we were eating, and we talked about our kids and how they'd grown up, and you know, he has two boys, and one's an architecture professor at the University of Arkansas. Another one is a senior executive with the hospital systems in Fort Worth, and we talked about our sons and girls, and I said, yeah, you know what? He said, what do you think made them grow up to be like that? I said, well, you know what? My rule was that if my father did it, I did exactly the opposite. And he looked at me and he said, you too? God judges without discrimination. It doesn't matter who you are, how you dressed, who you grew up with, what kind of life you had. It doesn't matter whether you're rich or you're poor or you're smart or you're not so smart. It doesn't matter. He judges without discrimination according to everybody's work. And our work is substandard. We are to be holy, for he is holy. Okay? So he says, if you call on him who judges without discrimination according to everyone's work as a father, spend your lives as exiles here on earth. What's an exile do? Describe an exile. What's an exile? This is the interactive part.
Whatever they're told.
Yeah, they're people who do whatever they're told. What else?
Servants.
They're servants. Okay, what else? If you are exiled somewhere, we're visitors. They're people who are not in their normal place. They are exiles. Okay, you remember that Peter wrote in the first couple of verses, to the exiles. Okay, so he says, spend your lives as exiles, people who aren't supposed to be where they're at. Spend your lives as exiles here on earth in reverent fear.
You have the word rendered out.
Yeah.
Redeemed out.
I do. It's reverent and it's redeemed, all right? It's ransomed. Okay, it's the same concept is down in verse 18, where it says silver or gold that you were redeemed. Reverent means that which is rich or that which is required. All right, and the word up top, you'll notice right at the top there, I've got reverent fear, and the word there how many people know that word? What happens if I change it to this? You know more Greek than you thought you knew. Spend your life in reverent fear. Fear meaning understanding a very deep and reverent responsibility towards God. 2 Corinthians 7:1. 2 Corinthians 7:1. Can I have 5 extra minutes? Is that okay? All right.
30 extra.
No, don't have 30, but if I can have 5. And we'll get back more with this on next Wednesday. Then he says the word, know that it was not with corruptible things. Okay? I'm sorry. I really apologize for doing this, but it's really important. How many words, we talked about this last week, how many words in Greek are there for the word love? Our single word love. You remember? There's 4. There's 4. We always forget eros because it's not in the scriptures. Eros never occurs in the scriptures. Erotic love never ever. The word never occurs in the scriptures. All right? But there are 4 words. Okay? There are also different words for the word no. Okay? And there are, realistically, 4 of them. One of the words for the word no is the word Ida. Ida means that you see it so you recognize it. Okay? Blepo simply means to see. Right? So if I see something, I blepo it. You know, I don't necessarily recognize it, right? But I see it, so therefore I kind of know about it. I was going to write it in Greek. Gnosko means to have knowledge, all right? To know something, all right? I know how to tie my shoes. I don't do it very well, but I know how to do it, right? After my strokes, I had to relearn how to tie my shoes. I learned that when I was 4 or earlier, okay? It used to take me 15 minutes to tie my shoes. 15 minutes. So they bought me sneakers with zip with whatever it is, the Velcro, you know? And I told them no. Because I was either going to relearn to tie my shoes or I was going to relearn to tie my shoes. Because if I had the Velcro, I would never relearn to tie my shoes. So I worked at it, and eventually it only took me 5 minutes. And now, maybe 30 seconds. Because my right hand doesn't work well, right? And so I can't get the finger where it's supposed to go. You know, it's supposed to go around and in, and I can't get it around and in sometimes. Okay? Knowledge. That's the word gnosko. Then they have a prefix, I keep on doing it in Greek, called epignosko. Epignosko is more of a knowledge based on, it's an intimate knowledge. Think of it that way. It's an intimate knowledge. I know Joe. I'm friends with Joe. We've known each other for a long time. Okay? But I epignosko my wife. Okay? When we had the oldie-wed game, one time we were on a retreat with Northlake, and 4 of us got up on a podium, you know, and they did the same thing as a newlywed game, except they called it the oldie-wed game. Okay? And they asked questions. Tony and I were the only couple that got every question right. Now that was dumb luck. You know, they just asked the right questions because, real honestly, we've only been married 40 years, so actually 45. So we don't know each other all that well. But they asked the question, what was your wife wearing when you first met her. I know exactly what Toni was wearing when I first met her. She was wearing a white blouse with white jeans and white ice skates. And her dark hair was below her waist. I know it exactly. And I can tell you where I was on the ice skating rink when I saw her. So if I ever want to, cheat, I'll have them feed me that question. Okay? I know exactly where I was. That's epiginosko. Now, I know exactly where my friend's wife was when Toni went over to her and introduced herself. Yeah, and that's the only reason I found out about Toni, because I saw Sherry over there hanging on the rail, right? And I saw Toni skate over to her. Right? I knew Sherry Gnosko. I know my wife, epignosko. I know all about her. Okay? He uses the word see here. See that it was not with corruptible things such as silver and gold with which you were redeemed. Why do you think he used the word see instead of gnosko or blepo? He uses ida. Because remember, see is with knowledge. And who was he seeing? Christ. And how was that person seeing him? Because he is resurrected. I see Christ, and I see that he was not corrupted in his death, but he was resurrected. Another application. I will never be corrupted in my death, because Christ overcame death by death so that I might live eternally. For those of us who have lost loved ones, I'm telling you now, if they knew Christ as their Savior, they are alive. Just as you are alive, living and breathing right now, they are alive. Now, they don't have a body right now, but they are alive. They are not laying in a grave. They are standing before Christ, worshiping him, living, breathing, so to speak. See that he was uncorrupted. They didn't know Christ. But he tells them, see, he is uncorrupted. Not blepo see, ida see, with knowledge. Recognize what it is that you're seeing. And we will end there. Let's pray. Father in heaven, in Jesus' name, we do thank you for this day and for what you've given us. And Lord, I just ask you might continue to bless as we seek to your will in the name of your Son. Amen.